Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where in the world you are. I'm Lisa Berkeley, and this is Reaction to Response, a webinar series which provides an opportunity to hear from thought leaders who are helping us shift from fear-based reactions to care and compassion-based responses. We're a project of the Charter for Compassion International's Women and Girls sector. And with the Charter for Compassion, we are in over 400 cities with 1,800 partners in 53 countries divided into 12 sectors. And you can learn more about us at charterforcompassion.org. Before we begin today's call with Sara Williamson, who is the founder and executive director of Protect the People and Protect the People Consulting, I'd like to do just a little bit of housekeeping. First, this call is being recorded. If you have any technological questions, you can go to zoom.us. And also, if you have any questions for Sara throughout the call, you can either type them in the chat box, or if you go down to the bottom of your screen and hover over, you'll see a place for question and answers. Also, we have a few people who are working with us behind the scenes, so this is just a big shout out and thank you to them: Sandy Hart, Brianna Lathorpe, Susan DeGaia, and Betsy Spano. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring Sara on for get into our conversation. So thank you, and good morning, Sara.
Good morning, Lisa, and good morning to everyone online. Thank you so much for having me today.
Awesome. So years ago, I don't know how many off the top of my head, you started Protect the People and Protect the People Consulting. Can you tell us a little bit about what those organizations do and what your involvement is with it?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lisa. It's been 7 years since I formed Protect the People. We first formed as an advisory group of humanitarian experts to help do some innovative things for humanitarian response. At the time when we formed in 2010, it was just after the Haiti earthquake and the Pakistan floods. And we saw a lot of different actors respond to those crises. But we saw also a lot of challenges with those particular mega crises, as they were called then. And two of those challenges were the ability of humanitarians and the military to interact with one another in the field to prevent physical violence against people affected by those disasters. And then we also saw the challenge of integrating the private sector and innovative social enterprise models like new technology companies into the response effectively. And so when Protect the People was first formed, we gathered the best and brightest in the field, in the UN and the Red Cross, lawyers, activists, field practitioners, specialists in technical aspects of response. And we came together to advise agencies on how to manage these challenges. And then 2 years ago, we formed a separate nonprofit division with a very generous gift from a private donor that allowed us to conduct some of our own operations and further engage in policy advocacy with the government and the military.
Okay. And what is it that, like, was it a lack? Is that what you were seeing? And what is it like in your heart that called you to get
Well, Lisa, my passion is really to fill gaps. As you know, there are so many humanitarian agencies, and for those who have looked at my background on LinkedIn or on our website, protectthepeople.org, you can tell that I've worked with some of the best agencies out there in the field. I'm a big fan of every agency I've ever worked for. They do amazing work, whether it's a UN agency or the Red Cross or a non-governmental organization like World Vision or the US Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. I believe strongly in all the work I've ever done. And after 20 years of working in the humanitarian sector, I strongly felt that there needed to be a more independent entity that could help address some of the emerging challenges and some of the hard issues that we have when it comes to the physical protection of people in crises. And this is a really tough challenge. It's hard to address without thinking about the security sector and about local governance. And so these are some of the gaps that we were hoping to fill. again, not as an operational agency, but as a support to operational agencies and as a support to government and military in particular.
Mm. And so I'm just sort of sitting here with that because it's very, for people who are watching, who don't have any background in policy and governance, I think one of the greatest questions is, what is it that like drives you? Like, what's your personal story? And I don't want to pry too much if it's too personal. So,
Oh, that's nice of you to ask. Yeah, I appreciate the informal format of our discussion today. And as I mentioned, I have worked in this sector for 20 years. And even before I was of legal working age, I was very much involved in humanitarian activities. My personal story is that my parents were serving as missionaries in East Africa, in Kenya, and I was born in a very small village called Mumias Village. It's in the Kakamega district of Western Kenya, and it's very close to where Barack Obama was born as well. And that's his claim to fame these days. But at the time when I was born there were no indicators of fame for that community. And in fact, when I tell people from Kenya that I was born in a drought year, they can guess exactly when I was born, because it was a terrible year of drought and hedging on famine. And my family, coming from the United States, they didn't really understand how to live without food and water and basic necessities. And they were really serving in a very far away place, and they really struggled. And so when I returned to the United States as a small child, I grew up with a lot of folklore around being born in the village and being born to the medicine man, and the fascination of the village around my birth, but also the hardship of life in the village in a drought year and in dealing with famine conditions. And this always motivated me to look for a way to do humanitarian work. And then when I was 15 years old, I went back to Kenya to build a school with a small team of also young students. And at the time when we were building the school, we had Somali refugees coming into northern and western Kenya. And so we had built the foundation of the school quite successfully. And then we had hundreds of squatters who were refugees from Somalia in the place where we were building. This really motivated me with compassion, much like your charter, to really think about the problems that these refugees face. And then they faced even greater problems because every day the Kenyan police would come with large dump trucks and literally beat them into these trucks and take them to refugee camps along the northern border with Somalia. And also some Sudanese refugees were taken to the border of Sudan and Kenya. And these refugee camps have been around as long as I've been in the humanitarian sector. Dadaab camp in northern Kenya and Kakuma camp in western Kenya have only grown exponentially in the last 20 years. And they both have a lot of challenges with physical violence against the population, particularly violence against women and girls. And so I'm a strong believer in humanitarian action, but I also believe we haven't done enough to prevent the physical violation of people, both male and female.
Wow, that's a really strong story. I'm so glad I asked that question. And finally, because I've been a fan of your work for a really long time, and I know you contribute a huge amount, but I've never known your story. So
thank you. Yeah, it is funny how it all does start with a personal story, and I think a lot of people believe that we can't protect people from physical violence, and I just don't think that's true. I think it is very difficult to protect people from physical violence when they have determined aggressors, particularly armed aggressors, and also aggressors within the family structure or within a cultural dynamic that makes it acceptable to violate people. But I think that this is really a gap that not many other agencies have been able to effectively address. And so we are mostly there to offer our support and our recommendations and to improve the relationship between the communities and those entities that have the mandate to protect them, not only UN agencies, but again, police and military personnel, and in some cases, peacekeeping and international forces as well.
Hmm. Well, yeah, that was sort of the first thing when I was listening to your story that popped into my mind, is because there's clearly this gap between when you listen to policymakers, or even never mind just policymakers, you turn on the TV or read the newspaper, there's always this kind of disassociation of like those refugees, you know, and certainly in the US from where we're communicating from, we have such issues around policy with our refugees, and maybe they're terrorists, and so there's someone to be more first afraid of, and then maybe we'll look at who are they as people, whereas you're coming from a totally different perspective, and really from a human heart perspective, and you know, that's huge. And so how do you, when you're working with policymakers or military people, how do you help them make that shift from fear to compassion and care? I mean, that's huge.
Yeah, oh, Lisa, you're so positive, and I wish I could say that we're always able to make that switch, but it's not always possible. It is true that we're living in a really difficult time with so many people on the move. We have over 20 million refugees on the move and over 60 million people displaced from their homes. And about 5 million of these people are due to the Syrian crisis, which I think has broken everyone's heart as we see the terrible images. And then we also are very discouraged, I think, as individuals and as agencies to see that the war is not ending in Syria. In fact, it's just getting more complex as we look at the news and see that peace is still a long way off. So I think there was really difficult challenges. And as you know, I just returned from Europe, where I had the pleasure of speaking in Stockholm at a European security conference that looked at the challenges that cities are facing in Europe, because they have 1 million new refugees arriving in Europe since 2015. And these 1 million refugees are predominantly from Syria, but there's also a number of Afghan and Yemeni refugees in Europe, and then also from sub-Saharan Africa. And as we know, a lot of people are being smuggled through Libya in order to reach Greece and Italy. And this is just a huge problem of epic proportions. And even though we don't see the large numbers crossing at sea that we did 2 years ago, we see a lot more people being stranded in transit countries, waiting for a chance to cross the border. So we see a lot more refugees in Turkey, a lot more refugees in Greece. And it is true that many of the terrorist attacks in Europe have been committed by people from the Middle East region, and this has put everyone on alarm. And so I think it is really difficult when you look at the specific situations where these cities in Europe have come under attack to say how we can reduce violent extremism. But also, more importantly, you can't really tell the difference between someone who might want to do you harm and someone who is seeking refuge. The only thing we do know is that people who intend to do harm have resources. They have fake identities. They have the ability to cross borders with ease. They really don't need humanitarian assistance or help from international agencies to do their work. They have illicit networks, they have criminal gangs. These aren't the same mechanisms that vulnerable people and that your average civilians will use. Mostly we see the civilian population of females, in particular refugee women and girls, now stuck in the transit countries. And predominantly, these women are trying to join their male relatives who arrived in Europe before they did. And so Protect the People very strongly believes that family reunification is very, very important to Syria, to Afghanistan, to Yemen, and to the African countries involved. Without family reunification, we have a dynamic in which most of the people who reached Europe, 80% of them are male, meaning that their female relatives are still waiting to join them. And this is just causing a real hardship for the family. And it's also causing social tensions because, as we know, men and boys need their families, and women and girls also need their men and boys. And so we can't really look at this as just an isolated individual problem. We need to think about the family units and how they're being affected by this crisis.
Wow, you've just given me so many more questions now. So, first, really thank you for that, because I've always thought how you just described the difference between a terrorist versus a refugee, that was so clear and articulate, and really what I hear you saying, which I don't think very many people have thought about, is that the terrorists are basically exploiting a vulnerable population of refugees, because to your point, they have the resources they need. They have it. They barely actually qualify as refugees. And so, forgive my naive question now.
Well, if I can just add, Lisa, another thing that's really important about the UN Refugee Convention that was written in 1951 is that it has an exclusion clause. So actually, someone who is committing harm or a crime or a war crime, an act against humanity, cannot receive refugee status. That person can't receive refugee status from a UN agency, and it cannot receive a refugee status from a government or any other authority. And so I think this is really important because the term refugee is inherently a civilian term for affected populations. The terrorist networks that exist out there, none of their individuals would qualify legally as a refugee or be eligible for asylum. And so I think really what many agencies are trying to encourage European governments to remember is that if they have a good screening process, and also if their own national security system is in place, they can very easily distinguish between who is a threat and who is using illicit networks to infiltrate their city or their border, and they can very easily see who is truly a civilian in need of assistance. And we need to realize that states are sophisticated and they do have these tools along their borders. And so we have to be a little bit more honest and say a terrorist can never be a refugee, and a refugee can rarely ever be a terrorist.
Thank you for that clarification. And I wish that I could put that on a huge banner in just about every city and community, certainly throughout the US and maybe even throughout the world, because that's such a clear distinction. And when you talk about the states having, states and nations having their own very clear capabilities to differentiate, it sure changes a lot of what we hear in the US media anyway, and probably even international media.
Yeah. Lisa, I should say that what we do need to be careful of in the United States and abroad is the radicalization of young immigrants in particular. And I think this is where people do confuse the issue, is that young people are being sought after as recruits, and there are strong forces on social media and in the news that are calling people toward very extreme ideologies. And I think that's where people get confused, is that oftentimes we are seeing people of nationalities that often do get refugee status being radicalized. And I think this is also a really big problem and issue. And it is something we just need to recognize is really happening at the community level, particularly for young men and some young women as well.
Well, this goes back to your point about if the quicker we can reunify families, I would imagine the less likely that those numbers would either diminish or stop. Well, I guess that's redundant, but yeah. So Going back to the separation of families,
Yeah.
do you see an increase then in violence towards women and children as a result of this separation, or is there no data about that?
There is some data, and we did produce a report on Syrian women in crisis that's on our website that you can read. We published it about a year ago now. And what we're really seeing is an increased vulnerability of women and girls in the countries surrounding Syria, the first countries of asylum, particularly Jordan and Lebanon, because the female refugees are not used to living without their male relatives. And now they have to find a way to work and be a bit more outside the home in order to access services like healthcare and education. And hope in a lot of men going to Europe all at once was that they would be able to get jobs and send remittances back to the family. But as we know, because of so many people converging upon Europe, the asylum systems there have been overworked. And so there are a lot of people waiting for their asylum status, which means that they're not eligible to work while they wait. And therefore, the women and girls in the camps are not receiving the type of remittances that they expected from their male relatives. And so we see a lot of women who want to work and a lot of women who don't want to work also because they're afraid of being harassed. And this is where the issue of early marriage comes up for women and girls. There's a lot of evidence that shows that rural families in Syria have married young women at much earlier ages than the age of 18, even prior to the crisis. But this is really exacerbated coping mechanism since Syrian refugees have been in camps for many years now. The marrying of the young women at early ages has a lot of practical value that is not always explained in the reports. And one of the craziest practical values is it means that once you're married, you're eligible for more humanitarian assistance. So imagine if you're a young woman by yourself, you might get a very small food ration. But if you're a young woman and you're married and you have a child, you will actually get a greater package of nutrients. You'll get more money. You'll get a larger home because humanitarian assistance is also about numbers. And the greater number you have in the family, the more assistance you get. So there is some evidence that families are growing just so that they can increase the amount of assistance they get as a coping mechanism. And this is a really sad reality that even after 5 years in exile, that young women feel that they will get more assistance if they in fact have a child or a husband or multiple children.
Oh, you just broke my heart a little further.
Yeah.
And I mean, what that does to family dynamics also. I mean, wow, it's such a rich, sounds too positive of a topic, but such a multifaceted and complex topic. I'm very grateful for this conversation because this is not my personal area of expertise.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how many people actually are aware of all of these kinds of things. And it's really, wow. So early childhood bride marriages is being, well, that's a bit redundant, but being a huge issue. So then where does something like education fit into this? And, or that's just not even a piece of it. It's just survival.
Education plays a huge role, and this is why UN agencies like UNICEF and other non-governmental organizations like Save the Children are really big on education for Syrian refugee children. It's really important for the family to realize that if a girl goes to school and completes her education, then she may be able to contribute financially to the family in the future. This is just so important, it can't be overstated. And so within the family, allowing the girl child to go to school is a really big deal and just has huge dividends for the family. but the family members have to see it and they have to accept it. And then there actually has to be a place for that girl to go to school. And as we know, it's really difficult to educate refugee children if the host country that receives them doesn't integrate them appropriately. So this is where we see even multilateral development banks like the World Bank stepping up and giving large-scale funds to states like Jordan and Lebanon to encourage them to open up education, and healthcare also is very important to refugee women and girls, and to allow those refugees to access those same services that a Jordanian woman or a Lebanese girl would. These are just wonderful efforts that will have long-term positive effects on the refugee population. And then we also see the families starting to go back into Syria, going back into Damascus, trying to rebuild amongst the rubble. And that has its own set of challenges because we see less agencies investing in the infrastructure that that population needs in order to support itself. With the space still contested, it's really hard to develop the infrastructure, but the population wants to go back. They're tired of being refugees. And the more support we can give them in Syria, I think we'll see more of them move back home in that direction.
It's so interesting because what keeps popping through my mind as you're talking is like, oh my God, the cultural shift also that this is like stirring up, because so many of these cultures, or let me speak specifically, because like the Syrian culture, we'll say, for example, I mean, which has been so patriarchal and male dominated, and suddenly you have this shift where could lead possibly to more women empowerment, maybe, but also the women going back to what's comfortable, which is getting involved at a younger age in creating family. But then when it comes to reunification, what everybody has been through, the amount of trauma that has occurred, like you can't go back after that, in as far as a family structure and cultural structure. So what I hear is both an individual, affecting each of the individuals, but a whole culture just changing rapidly. Does that ever come up in any conversations? When looking,
interesting, I think that it would be so nice if we had a Syrian woman right here beside me who could help us understand the cultural shift that's created. I do think we have some good stories from humanitarian agencies on the ground, from the women themselves, and certainly those women who have taken up jobs and employment, and those girls who have sought after their education. And some agencies have done some wonderful photo essays of what girls want to do when they grow up and when they return to Syria, how they want to be lawyers and doctors and contribute to a different society. I think we still don't know what Syria looks like 5 years from now. I think we're not sure that the men and the boys are ready for the women to take on a long-term change in the role that they serve within their families. We'll have to see about that, and we'll have to watch and wait. And certainly we have indicators from women and girls in the United States and in Europe who settle here as refugees, and they have to adjust. And I can say, particularly for Afghan women living here in Virginia, where our office is located, the Afghan women here in our local community have a different set of challenges than their male relatives. Oftentimes their male relatives speak English, are well educated, can get a job, can network. Washington, D.C. is all about networking, and certainly the Afghan men know how to do this very well. But their wives and their daughters struggle a little bit with that cultural dynamic of really being expected to live a private life at home and a quiet life at home. And this means not having access really to opportunities. And as we know in the States, we're a bit of a competitive culture right from the beginning of our young people's education. We teach them to go for opportunities, to go for sports teams, to compete in different academic and social environments. And this is just not something that Afghan women feel comfortable with. So I think that it's a very interesting balance culturally, and I wouldn't want to speak for them, but I would love to hear them be part of this conversation as well.
So I just want to say, first, thank you for your response. And I so appreciate your response, in that you're not going to speak for another group of people, which just further speaks to your integrity as an individual, and also the work that you're doing out in the world. Because that's really, certainly when we talk about systemic shifts of power, and certainly the way the world seems to be, one could argue, falling apart or realigning.
Yes.
That's part of what we're really trying to talk about, is giving everybody a voice. And so I just thank you for that. It was a great.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you.
So a few times you've mentioned working with the UN, and so I'm going to just put on the screen. We very often, Charter for Compassion tries to advance the UN sustainability goals. And let me get you and I out of the way here. Whoops.
Yes, I love those colorful blocks.
Pretty. Okay.
And the icons, they really help us remember what those goals are.
Right. So when we look at the sustainability goals, how does this play into addressing the issues of refugee? What do you, when you look through them, or are they not even valid?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. The thing about the goals that's so interesting is that, as you know, before the Sustainable Development Goals, we had the Millennium goals. And some of those goals were met, and we have less people living on $1 a day, which is extreme poverty, and even less people living on $2 a day, which is, more strangely acceptable rate of global poverty. And I think in the previous iteration of the goals, there was a lot of focus on long-term development, and there was less focus on those populations that are in humanitarian crises and shorter-term emergencies. And particularly populations that have been affected by conflict, that are on the move, have a lot harder time with economic development, because they're just so focused on their survival through the immediate moment and the days and weeks and unfortunately sometimes years of living in crisis. So I think there started to be a recognition near the end of the Millennium Goals that, hey, there's actually millions of people that are living in conflict and disaster affected crisis environments, and we can't leave them out. We have to include them in vaccination campaigns and health campaigns, in campaigns for better housing, for better education. And really, we need to better integrate people that have been affected by crisis and people that are on the move, integrate them into national systems of providing social services and benefits that will make their lives better too, and not see them as so exceptional, because now it's really not an exception. We just have so many people affected by violence now. We have so many people that need support, that humanitarian aid alone is not going to do it for them. So when I look at these goals, I think that these goals apply to everyone in the world, regardless of whether you're on the move or not, or whether you're from Syria or Afghanistan or Sudan or the United States. And even in the United States, we have some things that we can do with these goals to improve our communities. And certainly we know we're not alone in facing challenges in this time. And so I think that when we look at poverty, when we look at hunger, healthcare, education, gender equality, we can look at every nation in the world, every population in the world, and within these goals, we can also see the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where we really want to see people live without fear, and we want to see people live without want. We need people to be able to live a basic standard of living, and we need people to be able to live in safety. And so when I look at these goals, I think, it just brings me right back to the core of living in safety and with dignity. And that is really what we try to focus on at Protect the People.
Mhm. So this is kind of interesting. So in our last call, hold on, see if I can get this. Oops. Oh, sorry. We had um, a call with Bob Zuber of Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. And one of the things that came from the conversation was that we really need an 18th goal, which is
Yeah.
self-awareness and personal agency. And so this is one of the things that we've been starting to talk about now, because actually in reaction to response, we're really trying to help just normal people make a difference in the world and shift from reacting from fear to responding to from a place of care and compassion. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, and I hope that that's okay.
Yeah.
But does self-awareness and personal agency, meaning the opportunity to choose and make decisions of your personal life, how does this touch into working with refugees?
Well, I think this is a really fun goal. I don't know how open the UN will be to adopting it, but I think it's a nice idea to put out a citizen contribution to the goals. And I also just really relate to the personal agency, because I think that personal agency is something that humanitarian organizations and governments and also the security sector can help acknowledge in people. I think the self-awareness might be a little trickier because I see that more as an individual journey, that we're all on a journey to greater self-awareness. And I think it's a personal journey that may not be as easily assisted. But certainly when it comes to personal agency, I think what I am seeing in that is a reduced dependency. And this is so important because, especially when we think back to women and girls, one of my personal challenges with the humanitarian community is always seeing them as victims who need assistance. I really think that women and girls, even if they are survivors of terrible violence, that we need to help them see that they have choices in their life, that they have the opportunity to repair and rebuild and live healthy with good relationships. And I think that this personal agency is something we can encourage in everyone. And I would say the same, for men who are affected by joblessness and poverty, who feel disempowered and who take up violence as a way to feel powerful within their family. I think for them, we can also say that their personal agency can free them also from the urge to be violent and to take out their aggression on the female members of their family, and just encourage them that they have the ability to still work with dignity, and they have the ability to lead in their community, and they can also be an example to others even through hard times. So I think the message of agency can be different for men and for women and in different cultures, but I think it is a message that that we can share at all levels of governance and all levels of humanitarian response.
Well, it's interesting. So that was actually the point. I think the point in the conversation that it came out is, certainly at the UN, you have people who are from all countries around the world, and who basically, what 1 month of their living that could take care of in their home countries an entire family for at least a year. And so the responsibility of governmental or UN leadership to also have some self-awareness, to reflect on who they are, the decisions that they're making, and recognize their responsibility in their work, and not just caught up in the bureaucracy, and think about, who am I, what am I doing here, and how am I best being of service to the people whom I represent. And so, I then think too about the work that you do when you're working with governmental agencies or military. And I'm reminded of the numerous stories although I wish it was greater numbers, sorry, about peace negotiations. And when suddenly we start talking about children, then the conversations move forward, especially when there's a stalemate in the conversation of moving forward. And that when we look into ourselves and into our family, suddenly the conversation can be a little bit more, can be a little different and sometimes a little bit more challenging. But when you look to the future of what's the world we want to create, self-awareness kind of starts to shift a little bit. So that was, yeah.
I think self-awareness is really important for responders, and I'm really glad you brought that up, Lisa. It is very important because particularly those of us from the United States, we have to be aware of our Western culture and way of thinking. And I think also for those of us who are working cross-culturally, we have to be aware of our language. We also have to be aware of our race and our ethnic identity and our gender identity. And we have to be aware of how others perceive that and to acknowledge the different experiences that people will have, sometimes based on color or language group. And really we have to look deep down and see that there's a different power dynamic at play between those who have the resources to respond and those who receive the assistance themselves. And this power dynamic can be exploited. We do sometimes see different peacekeeping communities act inappropriately toward children in their missions, and we really need to do better at weeding out authorities throughout the entire UN structure to make sure that people that have access to large amount of resources are using them effectively for the population and not for any personal favors whatsoever, whether those would be sexual favors or any other type of servitude. So this is a big challenge, particularly in some contexts in Africa. And I think we'll continue to see progress, particularly under the new Secretary General who's made it a priority for UN peacekeeping to be accountable to the populations that it serves.
Mm-hmm. Wow. I'm just sort of letting it kind of wash over because we're touching on a lot of subjects. I'm also aware we only have about 15 minutes left in our call. So a few more questions, but I'm just going to put a pause here and say, for those who are participating right now, just so you know, today we will not be having our usual after party with Sara. We will have it for those of us who want to explore this conversation about how it's affected us and speak in our communities. But if you have any questions directly for Sara, please go ahead and type them in the chat or send them in the Q&A so we can be sure to include them, because she doesn't have the time. She's off doing her awesome work. So that's just an aside.
Yeah, if I can answer some questions in the next 15 minutes, Lisa, I'm happy to do so.
Right.
So feel free to point some thoughts to me from the group.
I will indeed. So in the meantime, I will continue to go down this road with you. What do you feel like is the biggest challenge that you face, both personally, if that's not too personal, and through your organization, through Protect the People?
I would say one of the personal challenges is not getting discouraged, Lisa. We're trying to tackle tough problems that there are others working to solve them, but sometimes Protect the People has the benefit of being right in the middle of a tough debate. And we're doing a lot of work right now on protecting civilians in the midst of conflict and active fighting. And this is a real big challenge, especially as we look at the perspective of what it takes to fight groups like ISIS and Al-Shabaab. The US is being very aggressive, and so are other actors, to counter this threat. And yet we're trying to advise that authorities exercise strategic patience and that they really think about how their actions are affecting the civilian population. This is something that is not easy to do. We can encourage, we can coach, we can offer some options that might reduce the impact on civilian life. But in reality, as we speak, Lisa, there's people living in besieged cities and towns and buildings who don't have a way out. And we hope the best for them. And as an individual, I pray for them. I think about them, and they really are the motivation for me behind my work. And one of my favorite questions when I'm interviewing people to serve as a consultant for us or to join our team is what motivates you. And I really think that we have to have at heart the interests of the population that unfortunately doesn't have a choice in the matter, but they live in an environment or they have been in a place that has been affected by something that makes them at risk of violence. And we want to reduce that risk. We want to ensure that less people experience physical violence. And we also want to help policymakers and decision makers see that their authority can have a really positive impact on people on the ground. And so we try to motivate others and try not to get discouraged ourselves when sometimes we'd like to see things go a different way. But we're living in a very complex and dangerous world. And we're not able to protect everyone from violence. And that's a true and difficult reality. But we have to maintain that motivation to help those we can.
Oh, I hope you have good care for your heart, because that's just a lot. We have a couple of comments and questions. Mary Spano says, strategic patience. She absolutely that concept.
I'm sure someone said it before me, but I've been saying it a lot lately.
Good reminder. Maria asks, what thoughts do you have about Greece and countries like Greece, where people do not have the basics for their living at the moment, and at the same time they have to deal with the huge number of refugees that come into a country?
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, there are great stories about Greece. I'm sure those of you who are active on social media have seen the stories about the restaurants in Greece that have opened up meals for refugees and have formed great friends, and the buildings and apartments and locations that are now full of diversity because cities and those who have properties have been very generous. And I think really the solution, when we don't find it at the national level or the international level, is among the people who are willing to be generous of spirit and take one another in and help one another. And I think we'd all like to think that we would be that person who would be open and who would be welcoming and who would offer something that perhaps we can't achieve at the global level yet, or we can't quite make a change at the national level, but within each of our lives, we can take some positive actions and see those reverberate. So I think Greece is full of good stories. And at the national level, I think the story is not finished yet. We hope for good economic recovery for Greece, and we also hope for family reunification from Greece to other parts of Europe as well.
Got it. Excellent. So there's a few comments of people saying thank you so much for all of your knowledge and feedback, and a couple of questions also about how does one become a team player or an employee of your cause. And I'm going to sort of add to that for the people who are watching, how can they get involved? I'm going to put a pause here too, though there is also there's another comment here or question. Hold on. I wonder if policy can be adjusted from awarding more food or money to those who marry and have children to the children and go to school themselves based on the act. Wait, I misunderstood. I wonder if policy can be adjusted from awarding more food or money to those who marry and have children to the children themselves based on the act of going to school. Looking at long term, it seems like something like this would lead to a decrease in the food and money needed for refugees. Of course, it would also mean providing money for teachers, books, buildings, and so I imagine this is another challenge. Okay. Um, I think what she's really saying is the importance of education. This is from Susan Dakaya. And so
Yeah,
she's basically, if I'm understanding this comment clearly,
yeah.
how can we help to educate, and how does that get into it? But I'm aware of time, and so
Okay.
I'm gonna maybe we can discuss this. I know you won't be able to be with us, or maybe you can address Susan's comment a little, just briefly for a moment. Um,
I think it's a very interesting question because what I hear you saying is,
I'm suggesting they pay kids to go to school. Thank you. Sorry, Susan. I'm sorry.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, what I hear you saying is changing the incentive structure of aid itself. And this is quite an interesting concept. And I think that providing the space for the kids to go to school is very important. There aren't enough spaces, there aren't enough educational institutions and teachers for the refugee children to go to school. So that is one thing to overcome. But then providing assistance to the children has some other technical challenges associated with that. Of course, we need the adults to take the responsibility for the children and care for their needs. So there may be some technical challenges, but changing the incentive structure is something the agencies really should look at in order to empower women and girls and reduce that dependency and reduce that almost like a strange effect of assistance that was unintended on the part of the agencies giving it. Mm-hmm. In terms of how you can become involved, you can like Protect the People on Facebook. You can go to our website, Protect the People, and donate. There are some specific things you can give toward. You can sign up through our website for our email mailing list, but we don't email people very often because we know that our inboxes are flooded with marketing material, and we want to be really honest and real with people about what we're doing. So I would just say you can follow us online, and if you have a background that's suitable to our work, I think there's probably a way through our website to submit some interest. You can also send me a note on LinkedIn. My name on LinkedIn is Sara Williamson, which is my maiden name and my middle name there. And if you have another question, you could send me a private message. And it may take me time to respond to you because, as Lisa said, I'm just getting back from several weeks of travel. But I will try to respond to you if you are specific with your question.
Awesome. So we have about 4 minutes left because I'm, again, very respectful of your time and so grateful that you're with us. So I guess the last question I have for you is, what would you like the biggest takeaway for us to be? Like, I mean, it's a huge issue that's going to take time, and to your points, we need to possess strategic patience. We know how we can get involved with your organization. Where does hope? I guess my question really is, where is hope and vision in this?
Yeah, I would just say that that each of us can take small actions that lead to better outcomes in our lives as individuals, but also in the lives of our families and our communities. And even within the United States, we have so much work to do for reconciliation for different groups that are living in conflict with one another. And I really hope that within the United States that we continue to see peace and prosperity through people actually being reconciled to one another. And this is hard work that we haven't talked about, but I think each of us within our communities have a lot of work to do in this time. And I would just encourage you that even if what you can do is seems like a small step, just remember that those steps are really important and that you can really make a difference in the life of others. And I've always believed that you don't need to be an international expert to protect people. You can keep your eyes open and see those around you who are vulnerable to violence, who may actually be victims of violence, and be that person that starts that conversation about whether they need help and how you can be part of their solution. And this is a really difficult thing to realize, but we know that in our local communities that there are victims of child abuse and victims of human trafficking and domestic abuse, and it may seem small compared to global conflict, but we don't want to see anyone living in violence. We want to see everyone living out the life that is best for them. And the more we're able to reach out, the stronger our communities will be. So I just encourage you, wherever you are, to think about those people who may be affected by violence, or those people who could possibly be in danger, and just open your eyes and your ears to see and hear what's going on around you, and do your part in protecting people close to you.
Oh, okay, that's a super, super important note for us to end on.
Thanks, Lisa.
I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today, Sarah.
You're welcome.
And for everyone who is on the call here, if you want to switch, we do have some questions and conversation topics about how we can protect the people within our own communities and what it is that we need to do to sort of springboard off of Sarah's concluding remarks. So if you want to join us in the after party, for those who are watching live, that is, you can join us in the chat panel up at the top. There's the information for how to join. Sarah, thank you so much for your time, and everyone else. We'll see you in a couple of weeks for the next Reaction to Response webinar series. And next month our theme is compassionate governance, and we'll be looking at how to build compassionate cities, which actually very much ties into this topic around how do we shift when we have populations shifting. So look forward to seeing everyone there. Thank you again, Sarah.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much for having me join you today. Bye-bye.